Hey, everybody, this is Jake Wynn, public historian, returning with my co host, Justin Voigthofer, public historian who works at the Gettysburg Foundation. We are back to discuss another episode of Masters of the Air, in this case, episode two. We are joined on this episode by our guest host, Avery Lentz, a good friend of both Justin and I. He works at Monocacy National Battlefield as a park ranger. He's also the founder and one of the co-hosts for the really amazing Battles and Banter podcast as well. Thank you so much for joining us, Avery.
Well, thank you for having me, Jake. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so we are very excited to talk about episode two of Masters of the Air, which, as a reminder, is a 9-part miniseries on Apple TV Plus from the same makers of filmmakers as Band of Brothers and The Pacific. The latest in their universe of World War II miniseries. And what this show is, what we discuss is kind of a little bit of a reaction to what we've seen, talk a little bit about the history, some things we noticed, and also talk about kind of our reactions to the show. So this is episode two. I'll just run through with a very quick recap of what we saw in episode two. So, spoiler alert, I would assume if you're watching this, I would hope you've already seen episode two. But spoiler alert, just in case. In this, we see the aftermath of the Bremen raid in episode one with things like interrogation, with the medical aftermath, chaos afterwards. We also see kind of the psychological and emotional toll of what one of these raids and losing, in this case, in episode one, they lose 3 bombers with 30 men from this unit on the Bremen raid. So we see the aftermath of some of that. We see some fighting, some fisticuffs between the U.S. Army Air Force, Army Air Corps, and the Royal Air Force, arguing over strategic bombing policy, which I think is very amusing. We'll talk more about that later. We get to see some of the ground crews at work, some of the work that went into loading up these bombers, getting them ready. We see a practice crash as well, because these crews, when they're not fighting missions, are also out there practicing as well. And then very excited, and we'll talk about this more, is the Norway raid, that we're going to see the story of navigator Harry Crosby and his work, kind of hilarious, a little bit of comedy thrown in here as well. Our lovable airsick navigator and narrator of this series. So we see some crash landings. We see what flak can do to aircraft. We see some malfunctions of B-17s, some gremlins, as we talked about in the aftermath of in the recap of episode one. All in all, a very loaded episode with a lot going on. So now let's talk about what we thought about that episode. So I'm going to throw it over to Justin to start us off. What was your reaction to episode two?
Yeah, and I think the main thing I wanted to talk about out of anything was I'm glad that the series talks about the immense amount of support staff that's needed for these missions and for these airplanes. That was one of the things I guess I didn't realize I was looking forward to before we started watching the series, but I'm glad that it's in there because the ground crews themselves have done or are kind of unsung because they're the ones that get the planes up in the air. When they're all shut up the day before, they work 24 hours, they get them ready for the next day's mission. And some of the planes that suffer pretty amazing damage are ready to fly the next day, which is a testament to mechanics and the ground crew and all the support staff that make up these bombers. I think it's very easy for us to just focus on the pilots and the bomber crewmen. But yeah, I'm glad the support staff. I hope will have their own episode, at least give you their experience and their view of these missions, right? Because those planes fly away and they will not know how busy their day is or what they're even going to face until they come back in. And pretty harrowing for the medics too, right? The medics know each plane coming down, if they're in trouble, if there's anybody wounded, will shoot off a flare. And that's the first thing that they know what their day is going to look like and the pretty grisly stuff that they might have to deal with. I made a point to talk about, I think Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg hate the Brits because this is the second portrayal of a aloof British officer who in Band of Brothers gets his tank blown up and then in here gets a right hook to the jaw. So I don't know what they have against British. I mean, and we talked about it, right? Like they are able to talk about a big, grandiose, strategic conundrum in a bar with a fist fight, right? I think that was a really great way. I'm sure. I mean, maybe this is an actual argument that happened, but this is definitely a way to talk about the differences between the RAF and the Army Air Force, and the pros and cons of each, and how each side kind of looked at each other. That is going to be a friction point for those two allies for most of the war. So I'm glad that they kind of showed it that way. But once again, I don't know if they needed to make the British officer have a stiff upper lip as they did. Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg, once again, I don't know what this nation of Britain has ever done to them. But anyway, I digress. And then lastly, Harry Crosby. I've fallen more in love with Harry Crosby the more I watch him, the more I read his book. But yeah, being lost and by pure luck finding exactly where you need to be. Harry, I can relate to that. Boy, can I relate to that. But I thought it was great showing his navigation during the mission. And yeah, the only scrambling around and doesn't know where he's at. And then thank God the Germans threw up a smoke kind of cover, and that itself tipped the hand to, okay, that's where we're going. And he, played it cool. It was like, oh yeah, no, that's where we need to be. So yeah, I thought that was just super relatable for anybody who's ever done like land navigation or anything. Is being completely lost, doubting yourself the entire way, and then like a beam of light, you see where you need to be. In this case, a giant cloud of smoke, you see where you need to be. So I just thought this episode is great. I think we're gonna have to say each episode's great, but this one was really good. And that Norway mission, I'm sure Jake will talk about this. There's a lot more they could have said. So my ending point would be just read Harry Crosby's memoir, because if you like this mission, if you like this episode, you're gonna love that book, because he goes into that and so much more. So that's what I thought. Avery, what did you think of the episode?
So I was really digging this show and how it's really trying to be its own thing. Obviously it still has the themes of Band of Brothers in the Pacific with like camaraderie and stuff, but I like that it's not trying to just copy those shows. It's trying to be its own thing. And I was really sold by the second episode. I was like, I actually care about these guys. like in the brief 2 episodes we've had, they've actually really done a good job developing at least some of the more front and center characters, and giving more depth to them. I think that's the first thing I really struck me is how different service members deal with post operation, like fatigue, or I guess for the lack of a better word, hangover to that stress, to that adrenaline. The scene on the wing between Bucky Egan and Lieutenant Curtis Biddick, played by Barry Kagan. He's like, are you feeling something? Are you feeling this? And he's, Kurt says, no, yeah, I miss those guys. And Egan's like, well, frick, I can't feel a thing, and he asked him to hit him, which I first thought was, so this is a major asking the lieutenant to punch him in the face. And I don't know if that's like, I could imagine that definitely happened in real life. It's just like, maybe this is an Army Air Force thing in World War II where, the ranks kind of don't matter as much, or, they're just much closer friends. I think the thing the show really nails is something that's felt a little different from the previous miniseries, is that these actors they look young, like I love Damian Lewis, but he never sold me as the 30-year-old guy in Band of Brothers, even though he may have been 30 at the time. Doesn't matter. Point is, this feels, you can feel the youth. You can feel that these were just young kids going over there and flying these things. And speak on the segueing over to kids, I really like how there's young British children kind of hanging out around the base, hanging out with the air crews and stuff. And if you notice, one of those kids does not have, is it a right arm? Like it's like the.
Oh, I didn't even notice that.
Yeah, I think he has it's like a prosthetic, like almost like Hulk right hand.
Yeah. So I was wondering, I'm like, man, are these kids survivors of the Blitz? Do they even have anyone anymore? And that's something that I haven't really thought about, is like, yeah, I mean, England obviously is not a large area, and even the Scotland attached to it, obviously, it could fit inside Montana. So when you think about the Allied forces and having American, British, Canadian, God knows who else crammed onto the same island, obviously they're all going to overlap. And so I think that's a really cool. So Justin, to kind of counter your point, yeah, they may not like, RAF, British forces as much, but at least this seems to have more of a voice to the locals, I guess, if that makes sense. That they're not just in the background, they are part of the everyday daily routine. So I really like that inclusion. And yeah, I have a soft spot for Crosby too. I like could totally relate to him, even just being airsick. I'm like, you know, have never gotten airsick on a plane, but there were a couple times hitting turbulence where I'm just like, oh god, you know. So I can get that sense of it. He's very relatable, but I'm really liking Barry Kagan's Curtis Biddick, because in that, even in that brawl, like it's still just such a 40s, like, all right, you me outside, you know, kind of thing. And you know, the whole scene where his B-17 is getting, you know, is damaged and he's falling behind, and then he's like, you guys go on without us. And as we saw in the previous episode, we know a lone B-17 is a goner pretty much. So that was very moving when Egan and Clevin make that decision that they're going to hang back. Everyone's going to ease off the throttle. We're all going home together. So to my, you know, kind of come full circle, I think that really sold me on the camaraderie and the brother aspect, band of brother aspect of this show that kind of connects it with the other two, but still, in a sense, it's its own show.
Yeah. That him slowing down and then a crash landing and then, you know, being in Scotland and drinking up with the locals.
Yeah.
I'm Irish. I'm from New York.
Yeah, you're not Irish, man. Yeah. Loved it.
Yeah.
What about you, Jake?
I mean, I think I have a few things to kind of to riff off what you both have already said, but that scene on the wing, I think that even more so than some of the dialogue between them, I think the thing that I found most poignant about that scene was the quiet. So you could hear as the sun is going up or coming is coming up or going down. You can't really tell what's happening there in the time frame. It's kind of just golden hour. It's beautiful, and you just hear the birds chirping, and they're just out there, and it's so quiet, and it just gets to this such a difference between the hell that they experience during the day on their missions, and then they come home and at night it's just peaceful and calm for the most part. And it's such a difference between those experiences. I can't imagine how mentally jarring that was to be over Berlin, you know, at home having breakfast, over Berlin being, you know, shelled and shot up by enemy fighters at noon, and hopefully at home having dinner by 6 o'clock. It's just it's really unique, and an experience unlike any others in the Second World War to have that, just such a difference between in the course of one day. And I think this episode does a really good job of showing that kind of juxtaposition between combat and their experiences when it's suddenly very quiet and they're back on their bases and thinking about everybody that they've just lost. I also think we see you know, a little bit of the absurdity of these bases with the bicycle race, which I think was it was kind of hysterical to watch that. And I think you know, it gets to the point of like, you hear a little bit, they don't directly address this, and I sort of wish they would, is that this unit was looked at for just having horrific discipline. I mean, just like there was no one in charge. They were all these hot shots, like the Bucky bromance that continues to rage at this point. You know, I think that's something that you know, I wish they would address that a little bit more. But finally, I'll just say that the Norway mission, while I think that they did a really good job of adding in some comedic levity to that story, which there really is a lot when you read Crosby's memoir, A Wing and a Prayer, about his experience. I would highly recommend reading the actual account, because it is even more absurd. It is even more absurd than you see in the miniseries. And even like when he arrives back on the base, he thinks he's in trouble because he's broken literally every protocol that they have as a navigator. That he gets out of the plane, runs off into the woods, goes back to his hut, and hides there until they come and pick him up for interrogation, as opposed to him getting onto the truck and rolling off to go to the hospital to see his friend Bubbles, the other navigator. It is a case of like the real history being even more absurd than what they're showing you in the miniseries. And I think that's where we're gonna see that in more of Crosby's more stories from his account in the next episode when we get into the Regensburg raid, which I think is one of the most vivid passages of Crosby's memoir, and one of the most gripping, horrific narratives of combat in the Second World War that I've ever read. But that's for the next episode. But yeah, just throw it back over to you guys in terms of like, if there's any of the kind of history behind this episode or other historical topics that you guys want to hit on, talking about that we've seen in this particular episode.
Say, Avery, you can go if you want to. I don't know if you had anything else.
No, I don't really. Honestly, this is still a part of World War II I'm learning more about. So this is all brand new to me. But makes sense they'd be targeting Norway because it seems like a closer target, or at least I wouldn't say easy target, but it's not, you're not flying over like mainland Europe in a sense.
Well,
I don't know.
yeah.
Like, is there truth to that, or is there anything to that?
Well, I think you see that. That's actually a good point you brought up, because I think what it also does a really good job of is the pre-mission briefings, right? These guys are woken up at 0300. They don't know where they're going until they get to that intel briefing.
The drum roll was great.
Right, and then they pull the curtain back, and then they will know what their mission is for the day, and they cheer, right? So you hear the Norway one, they're cheering because they're not going over Germany. They're not going through the flak batteries to get to Germany, all the fighters and everything as well. So it's no mission's a cakewalk, but for them, that is hey, that counts towards our 25, that counts towards what we're going, and it's a little bit easier up to Norway and over, as opposed to going through the gauntlet into, the heart of Germany, into the Rhineland and all that kind of stuff. So you do see that in the show, I think, which is really cool, is that during those intel briefings, and also what they also do a good job of showing in the intel briefings is where they're at in the formation of all the bombers, right? You don't want to be the last one. You don't want to be the lowest, because they're the ones that get pounced on by the German fighters the most. So I think I can't remember if it's during the Norway mission that they talk about, they're going to be in the front, they're going to be in the lead up top. So on the scale of, height and where they're at, they're kind of in the safest, I'm going to use air quotes, safest position in the entire formation, because they're in front, they're up top, they're not down low, they're not behind. And it's a little bit, the fighters, at least they've realized the German fighters like to pick off kind of the last folks in line, because they're a little bit easier to get into.
I was really scared for Kurt's playing this episode. I was like, are we losing it already? No.
Yeah. So. Yeah, I know. And with him going down, I thought that was great. And then also testament to Crosby too, why that mission is so memorable for him, is he diverts the plane from where they were supposed to go back to up and then down through Scotland, because he understands that if he needs to make a bailout, if he needs to go down, let's have him rather go down over land in friendly territory, as opposed to maybe in the Channel, or anywhere else in the North Sea and that kind of stuff. So I think that's great, because it shows you kind of how much control the lead navigator has for the unit, how much is on him to make sure that he's got his timing and everything right. But I thought it was great that they show those pre-mission briefings in more depth. For some men like that, I can't imagine their heart rate and what they must, they're waking up at 0300 every single day. You're told to get your stuff ready, get over the tent. And until that moment, you don't know if your day is going to be, it's not easy, but can be very, very hard. I'm sure we'll see that here soon with a couple of missions that are coming up, or be kind of, I don't know. Like I said, I want to use the term cakewalk, because none of those missions were a cakewalk, but a little bit easier.
Yeah.
Yep. And then I just want to add into, going back to the fight scene that we see between the RAF guys and the US guys. But I thought that was a really kind of amusing, if a little ham-fisted way of discussing some like really big picture strategic disagreements between the Royal Air Force and the US Army Air Force over their bombing campaigns. The RAF is over there bombing cities by night, and believing that's safer for their crews and getting them back, but is just pummeling German cities using incendiaries. Meanwhile, in 1943, the US is really focused on daylight strategic bombing, precision bombing, with the Norden bomb site that could put a bomb in a pickle barrel. which was not true at all. But I think that was a great way of showing the disagreement between the allies, and that there are moments in which the commanders of the air forces on respective sides almost do come to blows when they're having meetings about this. They end up hating each other as a result of this. So ultimately, they come to an agreement and kind of come to the idea of what they call round the clock bombing, which is the RAF bombs by night, the USAAF bombs by day, and 24 hours a day, relentless bombing campaign of occupied Europe is going to be the result. But I'm sure we'll see more of that in the future. But I did think that was an interesting way of showing some of the conversations that were going on, and some of the strategies and the difference in strategies that were at play.
Yeah, and I hope that one thing they talk about too is when we talk about precision, the Army Air Force uses the Norden bomb site is precise, but the numbers do not back that up, unfortunately. And I wonder if they will address that during the series of the belief was that they're able to be more precision focused during the day, but sometimes I have to get the numbers. I don't have them with me right now, but they're not as precise as when we hear precision today. We think of a missile hitting a specific room in a specific building. Good luck. There's a reason why they're dropping hundreds and hundreds of bombs is because they hope at least one of them hits where they need it to hit. So that's one thing to think about for precision. Yeah,
it raises a question to me too. Talking about that is something that we haven't seen in the trailers, and I'm very curious to see if we will see this at all. But is the landing of those bombs? That's something we haven't seen. We've seen bombs dropping away, but we have never seen them actually impacting anything. We haven't really seen that in the trailers either. So I'm wondering if that's something we're going to see through the series, because especially the ball turret gunner is watching those bombs go down and hit the target or not hit the target. And in many cases, and there's accounts in the Donald Miller book, of the ball turret gunner watching as the bombs miss the target and land in the neighborhood next to, say, a marshaling yard, a railroad yard, and pummel a neighborhood and just blow it to smithereens. And then you're dealing with the moral implications of this, of realizing you're bombing civilians, you're bombing women and children, you're bombing old people in those cities. And I'm just wondering if we'll ever see that, because right now we haven't even really alluded to it at all. And I really hope that we see that in this series, because I don't think it's going to do justice to the air war and the bombing campaign over Europe without addressing the moral conundrums that come with the bombing campaigns of the USAAF.
Yeah, I agree, Jake, and Justin. I think from the trailer, just thinking on it real quick, there will be a scene where Egan walks past like the rubble of a house, and I feel like that's going to be that time for reflection of like, wow, is that what we do? Is that what the neighborhoods look like that we nail it? And I think we're going to see a lot of close air support from at least the Tuskegee guys. That's still what I'm looking forward to most, because I did not think we would be getting that at all. And a story about the 8th Air Force, but from the coming mission for next week, looks like we're going to be down in that theater. Obviously, the 15th Air Force is the Tuskegee unit. They were stationed out of Italy. So, and I mean, a lot of their missions kind of intersect, especially when you're flying from England to North Africa, which I'm so scared for this week, because I think this is where it's going to get real. Like, this is, like, the Pacific had that, Band of Brothers had the episodes where, it's getting real, and I think it's going to start next week. So, yeah, I'm really looking forward to, I think, seeing those points. I think it's going to get deeper, and I think especially once you're introduced to the Red Tails, the inclusion of race and racial differences within the U.S. Army Air Force, that's not something we've had yet in these miniseries. So very, I don't know if excited is the right word, but I'm very interested to see how they portray that and how these storylines intersect.
Yeah, I mean, I think as we're winding down here, Avery, that's great. You're mentioning kind of what you're looking forward to. Is there anything else, that you want to see in the series, and is it living up to your expectations so far?
I mean, so far, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was a little skeptic a couple years back when I heard they were making this, because I was like, I mean, every episode is just going to be bombing runs, but these first 2 episodes had me on the edge of my seat. Like, it got me, like the adrenaline of like the moment, the anxiety, I guess helps being empathetic for a lot of folks out there. Just try to put yourself in that situation, especially if you're someone who's terrified of flying. Like, add combat to that. There's a really great podcast that the World War II Museum just put out, and they were interviewing Donald Miller and Tom Hanks, and what they said was it's 360-degree combat at 30,000 feet. There are no foxholes to take cover in. There's no protection. There's nowhere to hide. So I think just that feeling is something that I really, really wasn't expecting. So these first 2 episodes, it blew me away. And that's why next week I'm a little nervous for these guys, because I know this is going to be a spicy mission, and that's just putting it very lightly. So definitely it's fun to have something to tune into every week again. So.
Yeah, I think we see to that point. I think that's so well said, Avery. In regard to the podcast and talking about no foxholes. I think this upcoming episode is where we're going to see that. We just have to stay here and take it. Is kind of the mentality, and it's just almost like you could just see, like, there's nothing you can do about it, and it's just like everybody is just clenched. Like, it's just like you don't know what's going to happen at any moment. The shell with your name on it is coming up, and you can never tell it's coming. And I can't imagine how these guys did this. I really.
Well, I think sorry, I think you see them coping away with. I'm glad they've made the point. This is my lucky snow globe. This is my lucky $2 bill that the corners are cut off. Right? These superstitions. We laugh at them or whatever, but for these guys, it was one thing to grasp onto, to try to grab some of that control back. Hey, I will be okay if I have this snow globe. Now, if obviously we know that that's not necessarily the case, how many guys had stuff that went down, but that's their reaction to let me at least try to grasp some sort of control to this whole situation, because I really don't have any. I guess I'm glad that they kind of have made that a point to show that, even if they're not really focusing on it in a big sense. But yeah.
I did think the throwing of this whole salt shaker over the shoulder.
I thought it was a scene from Dumb and Dumber again. I was just, it's like, they did this in Dumb and Dumber already, but yeah.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for being here. Avery, we really appreciate you jumping on and chatting with us, and may see you again in future episodes. So thank you for being here and chatting with us. And Justin, thank you for being the co-host here, public historian, and employed by the Gettysburg Foundation. Really glad to be co-hosting this with you. I'm Jake Wynn, public historian as well. Thank you guys so much for watching as well. We really appreciate the support. You can give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed this episode. Subscribe, follow, depending on where you're watching this. And let us know what you think about episode 2 of Masters of the Air, and what you think of this series so far in the comments as well. We really appreciate the support, and we hope that you'll tune in for future episodes. We're planning on doing this for each of the 9 episodes in the series, and maybe a few more after that as well. So thank you guys so much, and we will see you next time.